The footsteps were already on the second floor. Three men, moving in practiced silence through a house that was supposed to be empty. Gloved hands, dark clothing, earpieces. They'd done this before, too many times to count, and every single time it had gone exactly as planned. They were good at this, frighteningly good. The kind of good that only comes from doing something so often that fear stops showing up. The first man, the one they called Marco, swept through the master bedroom with a small flashlight pressed against his palm, keeping the beam low. He moved to the bedside table, checked the drawers, found nothing of interest, then moved toward the built-in wardrobe. The second man, a quieter one named Drez, was already in the study downstairs, working through the desk with the focus of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. The third man, stationed near the front entrance, watched the driveway through a gap in the curtain. Everything was calm. Everything was controlled. And then, from somewhere above Marco's head, from a room he hadn't checked yet, came a sound. Small, faint, almost nothing. But in the thick silence of that house, it landed like a gunshot. It was a child's voice, low and careful, like someone trying very hard not to be heard, like someone who already knew something was wrong. Marco stopped breathing. He pressed himself against the hallway wall and stared at the ceiling, then slowly looked down the corridor toward the room at the end of the hall. The door was not fully closed. A thin sliver of warm light leaked from underneath it. He clicked twice into his earpiece. Drez's voice came back immediately, tight and controlled. "What?" Marco said nothing, just two more clicks. The message was clear. Something's wrong. To understand how three professional criminals ended up frozen in that hallway, staring at a child's bedroom door like it was the mouth of something they couldn't name, you need to go back to the beginning. Back to the man who owned that house, and back to the moment someone decided he was worth targeting. His name was Raymond Osai, 44 years old, founder of a mid-sized import and logistics company that had, over the last decade, grown quietly into something considerably larger than anyone expected. He wasn't flashy. He didn't post photos of his watches or talk about his revenue in interviews, but anyone paying attention could see it. The property on the edge of the city, set back from the road by a long gravel driveway lined with mature trees. The two vehicles in the garage, the quiet household staff who came and went on a tight schedule. The security cameras positioned at the gate, the front door, the side entrance. Raymond Osai was the kind of wealth that doesn't announce itself, which, in a cruel twist, made him more attractive to people who watched carefully. And someone had been watching. The group that had been tracking Raymond for nearly 6 weeks was not a loose collection of opportunists. These were men with a system. Marco had run successful operations in 3 different cities. Drez was technically gifted. Alarms, locks, camera loops. He'd learned his skills somewhere that no one asked about anymore. The third man at the door, who went by the name Sleek, handled logistics, timing, escape routes, communication. Between the 3 of them, they'd never once had an operation fall apart mid-execution. Their intelligence on Raymond's household had come from someone on the inside. Not a direct employee, it was never that obvious, but someone connected closely enough to know the rhythms of the house, the schedule, the routines, who came, who went, and most critically, when the house went quiet. That routine was almost insultingly consistent. Raymond left for his office every weekday before 8 in the morning. His housekeeper arrived at 9 and left by 1. His wife was involved in a regular set of midweek activities that kept her out of the house from early afternoon until early evening. And their daughter, 11 years old, a quiet, serious child named Abena, was in school from 7:30 to 3:15, after which she attended an after-school enrichment program that ran until 5. The window between 1 o'clock and 3:15 was, according to every piece of intelligence they had collected, an empty house, completely empty, No staff, no family, no variables. That routine had been observed across 4 separate weeks. It had never once changed. What they didn't know was that the report was already wrong. The thing about routines is that they are only reliable until the moment they aren't. And on that particular Tuesday, the enrichment program had been canceled, not announced widely, not updated on any external calendar, simply canceled. A facilitator had called in sick that morning, and the school had sent a brief message through the parent communication app that Abena's mother had seen, forwarded to the housekeeper, and promptly forgotten to mention to anyone else. The housekeeper had collected Abena at the normal school dismissal time, 1:30 in the afternoon. She'd brought the child home, settled her in front of the TV in the upstairs sitting room with a bowl of cut fruit and a glass of juice, and left at her usual time of 1 o'clock, or close enough to it that the difference didn't seem to matter. Abena had kicked off her shoes near the stairs. She'd poured herself more juice. She'd curled up under a blanket with the remote control and a book she was only half committed to, alternating between the two in the way that 11-year-olds do when they have the house to themselves and no adult is watching. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't anxious. She was a child at home, waiting for her mother. One changed routine was enough to rewrite everything. Marco, Drez, and Sleek had entered the property at 12 minutes past 2. Sleek had already managed the front gate, a signal loop that bought them a clean entry without triggering the external cameras. Drez had handled the door in under 40 seconds. They had rehearsed this particular entry point twice, on foot, from the road, just to know the angles. They knew the camera positions. They knew the interior layout from a floor plan that their source had sketched from memory. They stepped inside, and the house received them in silence. Drez moved to the alarm panel inside the entrance immediately, working from a code that their source had provided. He paused for 3 seconds while the system processed, then exhaled as the panel's quiet beeping stopped. The house was disarmed. Marco looked around the entrance hall. High ceilings, polished stone floor, a console table with a bowl of keys and a small vase of fresh flowers that were still in good condition. He mentally noted which direction led to the study, which direction led upstairs. He pointed at Drez and gestured toward the back of the house. He pointed at Sleek and gestured toward the entrance. He pointed at himself and toward the staircase. They separated without a word. For the first 4 minutes, everything proceeded exactly as they had planned. Then, Marco noticed the shoes. Small shoes, pale pink canvas with Velcro straps and a slight scuff on the left toe. They were sitting at the base of the staircase in the careless sideways fashion that children abandon their shoes, not placed neatly, just dropped. One was on its side. Marco stopped. He crouched and looked at the shoes without touching them. Then he straightened and looked up the staircase. The landing above was partially visible. The lights up there were on. He pressed his earpiece. Drez. Yeah? Come to the stairs. A pause. Why? Just come. 15 seconds later, Drez appeared from the hallway. He saw Marco standing at the foot of the staircase. He followed Marco's gaze to the shoes, then looked up at the lit landing. His jaw tightened. The light was on when we came in, Drez said, his voice barely above a breath. I know. We thought it was a timer. I know what we thought. They stood there for a moment, 2 men recalculating. Sleek's voice came into both their earpieces. What's the holdup? You're burning time. Marco said, quietly and carefully, we may have a problem. What kind of problem? Marco looked at the shoes again, the kind we didn't plan for. This didn't feel empty anymore. Upstairs, Abena had muted the television. She wasn't sure why. She'd heard something, or thought she had, a soft sound from somewhere below. It could have been nothing. The house made sounds sometimes. She'd lived in it long enough to know that. Pipes, the wind against the windows, the refrigerator cycling through its low mechanical hum. She'd told herself it was nothing, and then she'd heard it again, and this time it was unmistakably the sound of movement, deliberate, careful movement. She sat very still on the couch and listened. Nothing for a moment. Then the sound of someone on the stairs. Abena did not scream. She did not run. She moved with a speed and quietness that surprised even herself, sliding off the couch and crossing to the door of the sitting room in 3 silent steps. She looked through the gap at the hinge side of the door, and she saw the top of a man's head appearing over the staircase railing. A man she had never seen before, a man wearing dark clothing and a glove on the hand that was gripping the railing. She backed away from the door without making a sound, moved across the room, looked at the window, looked at the door, looked at the wardrobe. She went into the wardrobe, pulled it closed behind her, and sat down between a hanging coat and a folded blanket on the bottom shelf and pressed herself as far back as the space allowed. She could hear her own heartbeat, and then she heard his footsteps stop just outside the door. Marco stood in the corridor. He could feel it now, that specific quality of air in a room that isn't empty. He'd broken into enough houses to know what empty felt like, and this did not feel empty. There was warmth in this corridor that wasn't coming from the heating system. There was a faint smell that he could only describe as recent. Someone had been here recently, was here now, was close. He pushed the door open slowly. The sitting room was quiet. The television was on, but muted. A children's program, colorful and soundless on the screen. A bowl of fruit on the coffee table, half eaten. A blanket pushed to one side of the couch as though someone had just stood up. Marco stood in the doorway and didn't move for 5 full seconds. "Someone's here," he said into his earpiece. Sleek's voice came back hard. "How sure are you?" 100. A pause, then Drez. Kid or adult? Marco looked at the shoes he'd already seen downstairs, mentally measured them, looked at the child's program on the screen, looked at the fruit bowl with its small plastic fork. Kid. The silence that followed lasted almost 4 seconds. In that silence, a great many things shifted between the 3 of them. The weight of the operation changed completely. What had been a calculated property crime became something else entirely. Something with a witness, something with consequences that extended far beyond whatever was in Raymond Osai's study. "We need to pull out," Marco said. Sleek's voice was tight. "We haven't finished. I'm not suggesting we discuss it. Marco, there is a child in this room somewhere, right now. We are done." It was Drez who found the wardrobe. Not deliberately. He'd come upstairs to find Marco, and he'd moved instinctively to check the room, and his hand had gone to the wardrobe door the way his hand always went to any closed door, because that was how he'd been trained. That was what the muscle memory of years doing this had made automatic. He pulled it open, and there was Abena. She was sitting with her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and she was looking at him with eyes that were completely dry and completely terrified at the same time. The eyes of a child who has decided that crying is a luxury she cannot afford right now. She was holding her breath. Drez stared at her. He had a daughter. She was 9. He hadn't seen her in over a year. He took 1 step back from the wardrobe and turned around and said, in a voice so strained it was barely recognizable, "Marco, we are leaving, right now, all of us." Marco was already at the door. He looked at Drez. Drez didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. Marco looked at the child in the wardrobe and said very quietly, "We're going. Don't move. Don't call anyone for 10 minutes. He didn't know why he said the last part. He didn't actually expect her to listen. It was just the only thing he could think to say. It was no longer a robbery, it was a disaster unfolding in real time. They left the way they came in, but nothing about the exit felt like their entry. The controlled, quiet efficiency of 2 hours ago was gone. Sleek was already in the car before the other two reached the bottom of the staircase. Drez replaced the alarm panel to its armed state out of pure mechanical habit. Marco pulled the front door shut and they moved across the gravel and through the gate in under 90 seconds. They did not speak during the drive. Abena had not stayed still for 10 minutes. She had, in fact, moved the moment she heard the front door close, and she had gone directly to the landline telephone in her parents' bedroom, and she had called her mother, and when her mother answered, Abena's voice, steady, impossibly steady for an 11-year-old child, said, "Mum, I need you to come home, and I need you to call the police." By the time the police arrived, the house was undisturbed in the ways that mattered. The alarm had been reset. The front door showed no visible signs of forced entry. Only Drez's expert neutralization of the lock had left any trace at all, and it took a forensic locksmith to find it. The investigation began with a simple question. How had 3 experienced criminals operated on faulty intelligence? The answer, when it eventually emerged, was almost unbearably small. The source who had provided the household schedule had noted the after-school program's regular end time of 5 o'clock. He had noted it once from a document he'd seen briefly and not retained. What he had not known, what no one had told him, was that the program was run by an external provider that operated on its own calendar, independent of the school's. Cancellations were not uncommon, they were simply not visible to anyone who wasn't directly enrolled. One piece of missing information, one scheduling gap between 2 organizations that didn't talk to each other. That was the entire margin between a completed robbery and the moment Drez opened a wardrobe door and found himself staring at a 9-year-old's face in a 30-year-old man's child. All 3 were identified within 72 hours. The source was located within a week. Abena gave her account to investigators in a single, uninterrupted statement. She described what she had seen, what she had heard, and what she had done. The officer who took her statement later said privately that she had been the most composed witness he had spoken to in 11 years of police work. Raymond Osei installed a secondary alarm system the following month. His wife added a deadbolt to the interior of every bedroom door, and for a long time after, Abena left her bedroom light on when she slept. They planned everything perfectly, except for the one thing they never checked: whether someone was still inside. If this story stayed with you, if you felt that weight, then you know exactly why these cases matter. Hit like, drop a comment telling me what part got you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Every story on this channel is researched, written, and told to make sure you never forget it. See you in the next one.